December 16, 1976, 2:30 in the morning. Inside the walls of Graceland, Elvis Aaron Presley sits alone in his private study, surrounded by towers of unopened fan mail. His hands are trembling, not from the pills this time, from fear. In his lap sits a single piece of notebook paper, torn from a child's school binder. The edges are stained with what looks like tears, maybe blood. The handwriting is shaky, desperate, and what this 12-year-old girl from Kentucky wrote to him has just shattered everything Elvis thought he knew about fame. About himself. About the price of being hope for people who have nothing left to lose. You see, most people think they know Elvis's story, the poor boy from Tupelo who became the king of rock and roll. But what they don't know is that by December 1976, Elvis was drowning. Not in drugs, not in fame, not in the lifestyle that was slowly killing him. He was drowning in the weight of being a lifeline for millions of people who saw him as their only escape from hell. And this letter, this crumpled piece of paper that made the most famous man in the world sob like a broken child. It contained a truth so devastating that it would haunt Elvis until his dying breath, exactly 8 months later. Because what this little girl wrote exposed the one thing Elvis had spent his entire career trying to hide. The one secret that terrified him more than any scandal, any failure, any humiliation he'd ever faced. The secret that he was still just that scared little boy from East Tupelo, and he had no idea how to save the people who believed he could save them. This is the story of the letter that broke Elvis Presley, and once you hear what was inside it, you'll never think about the king the same way again. Memphis, Tennessee, December 1976. Elvis Presley should have been on top of the world. His latest album was climbing the charts. Concert tickets were selling out in minutes. The money was pouring in faster than even Colonel Parker could count it. But inside the pink brick walls of Graceland, the king of rock and roll was falling apart. Every morning started the same way. Elvis would wake up around noon, stumble downstairs in his silk pajamas, and find them waiting for him. Stacks upon stacks of letters, fan mail that arrived by the truckload. Literally, the postal service had to make special deliveries to Graceland because the volume was so overwhelming. His staff had a system. Joe Esposito, his road manager, would sort through thousands of letters each week. The requests for autographs went in one pile, the marriage proposals in another, the desperate pleas for money, for help, for miracles, those usually went straight in the trash. Elvis can't read all of these, Joe would tell the newer staff members. It would destroy him. But Joe didn't understand what was already destroying Elvis. It wasn't the letters he read. It was the letters he didn't read. Because late at night, when the house was quiet and the hangers-on had gone home, Elvis would sneak down to the mail room and rescue letters from the garbage. He'd sit there for hours, reading story after story of heartbreak, of poverty, of people who had nothing left except his voice coming through their radio. December 16th was different, though. It was the anniversary of his mother's death, and Elvis was in one of his dark moods. Gladys had been gone for 18 years, but the pain still felt fresh, raw, like an infected wound that wouldn't heal. He'd been thinking about her all day, about how she'd died while he was away making movies in Hollywood, about how she'd spent her final years watching her son become someone she barely recognized, about how the last thing she'd said to him was, "Don't forget where you come from, baby. Don't forget the people like us." The people like us, that phrase had been echoing in his head for hours. So when Elvis walked into the mailroom that night, he wasn't looking for distraction. He was looking for connection, for proof that somewhere out there, people still remembered that he'd once been one of them. Poor, hungry, desperate. That's when he saw it. Sitting right on top of Joe's trash pile was an envelope that looked different from the others. The paper was cheap, the kind you'd buy at a gas station. The handwriting was unsteady, like whoever wrote it was either very young or very scared, maybe both. But what caught Elvis's attention wasn't the envelope. It was the return address, Sarah Ann, Rural Route 3, Hazard, Kentucky. Hazard, Elvis knew that name. It was coal country, the kind of place where his own father had once looked for work, the kind of place where families lived in shacks without electricity, where children went to bed hungry more nights than not. The kind of place Elvis had sworn he'd escaped forever. His hands were shaking as he pulled the letter from the trash. Joe had probably taken one look at the return address and assumed it was another sob story, another hand reaching out for money that would never come. But something about this letter felt different, urgent, like whoever wrote it had used their last bit of hope to get these words to him. Elvis looked around the empty mail room, making sure he was alone. Then he carefully opened the envelope, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in the silence. The letter was written on notebook paper, the kind with the blue lines and the red margin, 3 pages, front and back. The handwriting started neat at the top, but got messier as it went on, like the writer was crying or running out of time. At the top, in careful cursive letters, were the words, "Dear Mr. Elvis Presley, my name is Sarah Ann and I am 12 years old. I don't think you will ever read this, but I had to try." Elvis felt his stomach drop. Something about those words, that simple honesty, reminded him of the letters he used to write to his heroes when he was a kid, back when he still believed that famous people might actually care about boys like him. He kept reading. "I know you probably get millions of letters from people asking for things, money and autographs and stuff like that, but I'm not writing to ask you for anything. I'm writing to tell you something, and I hope you'll understand why I had to." The next line made Elvis's blood run cold. "I wanted you to know what hope sounds like to people like us." People like us, the same phrase his mother had used, the same words that had been haunting him all day. But what came next in that letter would haunt Elvis Presley for the rest of his life. Because this little girl from Kentucky was about to show him something that would shatter his world and force him to confront a truth he'd been running from since the day he left Tupelo. The truth about what happens when you become someone's only reason to keep living. And what that weight can do to your soul. Elvis read that line 3 times before it fully hit him. "I wanted you to know what hope sounds like to people like us." His hands were already shaking, but now his whole body felt cold, because he had a terrible feeling he knew exactly what this little girl was about to tell him, and he wasn't sure he was strong enough to hear it. But he kept reading. "Mr. Elvis, I live in a place where hope is hard to find. My daddy died in the mines 2 years ago when I was 10. The roof collapsed, and they never even found his whole body, just enough to bury something in the cemetery behind our church." Elvis felt his chest tighten. He'd grown up hearing stories like this. His own father had worked dangerous jobs, always one accident away from leaving his family with nothing. But Vernon Presley had been lucky. This little girl's father hadn't been. After Daddy died, everything changed. Mama had to get work at 3 different places just to keep food on the table. She cleans offices in town at night, works at the diner during the day, and takes in washing on the weekends. I hardly ever see her except when she's falling asleep standing up. The letter went on, and with every word, Elvis felt like he was being pulled back in time. Back to East Tupelo, where his own mother had worked herself to the bone trying to keep their family afloat, where they'd moved from one rundown shack to another, always one step ahead of eviction, always hungry, always afraid. "We don't have electricity anymore because we can't pay the bill. We use candles at night, but only when we really need to because candles cost money too. My little brother Tommy is only 8, and he asks me why we can't just flip a switch like other people. I don't know what to tell him." Elvis had to stop reading. His vision was blurring, and not from tears, from memories. He could see his childhood kitchen, lit by a single bare bulb when they could afford to keep the lights on. He could remember the shame of being the kid whose electricity got shut off, whose stomach growled during class, whose shoes had holes that let in the Mississippi mud. But he forced himself to keep reading, because something told him this little girl had more courage in her pinky finger than he'd had in years. "The thing is, Mr. Elvis, we have this old radio that runs on batteries. It was Daddy's, and it's about the only thing of his we kept. When the batteries are working, we listen to the music station out of Lexington. And sometimes, late at night when Mama's at work and Tommy can't sleep because he's hungry, your songs come on. This is where Elvis's hands started shaking so badly he almost dropped the letter. When Love Me Tender plays, Tommy stops crying. When Can't Help Falling in Love comes on, Mama hums along even though she's exhausted. And when Gospel According to Elvis plays on Sunday mornings, we all sit around that little radio like it's our own private church service. Elvis felt like someone had reached into his chest and squeezed his heart. He'd sung those songs in fancy recording studios, surrounded by musicians and producers and people who were paid to tell him how great he was. But he'd never really thought about where those songs went after they left the studio. Who was listening? What they meant to people whose worlds were falling apart. But here's what I really wanted to tell you, Mr. Elvis. Last month, Mama got real sick. So sick she couldn't work for almost 2 weeks. We didn't have any money coming in, and we ran out of food. Tommy was crying all the time, and I was scared we were going to have to go to the county home like some of the other kids from school. Elvis knew about county homes. He'd been terrified of them as a child. Places where families got separated, where kids disappeared into a system that didn't care if they lived or died. I was sitting by that radio, trying to find some music to make Tommy feel better when Don't Be Cruel came on. And all of a sudden, I wasn't scared anymore. I don't know why. The words don't have anything to do with being poor or hungry or alone. But something about your voice made me feel like someone out there understood what it was like to hurt. Elvis had to put the letter down. He was crying now, full tears streaming down his face, because he remembered exactly what it felt like to be that scared, that desperate, that alone. And he remembered the singers who had saved him. Guys like Dean Martin and Roy Orbison, whose voices had come through his own family's little radio and made him believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a world beyond the poverty and the fear. But those singers had never known his name, had never read a letter from little Elvis Presley from Tupelo, Mississippi. They'd saved him without ever knowing he existed. Now this little girl was telling him that he'd done the same thing for her family, that his voice, recorded years ago in studios he could barely remember, had somehow reached across the darkness and given hope to people who had every reason to give up. The next part of the letter hit him like a physical blow. So I started singing Don't Be Cruel to Tommy when he got scared. And you know what? He started singing it back to me. Before long, we were both singing your songs all the time. When we were hungry, we'd sing Hound Dog and pretend we were tough enough to handle anything. When we missed Daddy, we'd sing Love Me Tender and imagine he was still with us somehow. Elvis was sobbing now, full, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep in his soul, because he finally understood what his mother had tried to tell him all those years ago. Don't forget where you come from. Don't forget the people like us. The people like us weren't his fans. They were his family. They were the reason he'd been given this voice, this gift, this impossible responsibility. But the letter wasn't finished, and what Sarah Ann wrote next would destroy everything Elvis thought he knew about the weight of fame. Mr. Elvis, I need you to know that your music didn't just make us feel better, it kept us alive. Because 3 weeks ago, when things got really bad and I didn't think we could make it anymore, I was ready to give up. I was ready to take Tommy and just stop trying. Elvis felt the room spin around him. This wasn't just about comfort anymore. This wasn't just about entertainment or even hope. This little girl was telling him that his music was literally the difference between life and death for her family. But then He Touched Me came on the radio, and I remembered that someone out there cared enough to sing about faith and love and not giving up. I remembered that you came from people like us and you made it out, so maybe we could make it through. The final lines of the letter were written in shakier handwriting, like Sarah Ann had been crying as she wrote them. I don't know if you'll ever read this, Mr. Elvis, and I'm not asking you to write back or send money or anything like that. I just wanted you to know that somewhere in Kentucky, there's a little girl and her brother who go to sleep every night singing your songs. And tomorrow, when things get hard again, we'll turn on Daddy's old radio and wait for your voice to remind us that we're not alone. Elvis finished reading and sat in complete silence for what felt like hours. The letter fell from his hands onto the floor, but he couldn't move to pick it up, because Sarah Ann had just shown him something that terrified him more than his own mortality. She'd shown him that he wasn't just Elvis Presley, entertainer. He was hope itself for people who had nowhere else to turn. And tomorrow morning, he was going to have to figure out how to carry that weight without it crushing him completely. But what he decided to do about Sarah Ann and her family would haunt him until his dying day. Elvis sat in that mail room until sunrise, staring at Sarah Ann's letter. By the time the sun came up over Memphis, he'd made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find this little girl and her family, and he was going to help them. But he wasn't going to tell anyone about it. See, Elvis had learned the hard way that good intentions and fame don't mix. Every time he'd helped someone publicly, it became a circus. Reporters, photographers, people coming out of the woodwork claiming they deserved help too. The colonel would swoop in, turn it into a publicity stunt, and suddenly Elvis's private compassion became just another way to sell records. This time would be different. This time, it would be real. The first thing Elvis did was call his most trusted investigator, a guy named Red West who'd been with him since high school. Red had helped Elvis track down old friends before, usually for reunions or surprise visits, but this felt different, more urgent. "Red, I need you to find someone for me," Elvis said, his voice still hoarse from crying. "A little girl named Sarah Ann lives on rural Route 3 in Hazard, Kentucky. Her daddy died in a mine accident 2 years ago. I need you to find her fast, but I need you to be discreet about it." Red had worked with Elvis long enough to know when not to ask questions. "How discreet are we talking, boss?" "I don't want Colonel Parker to know. I don't want Joe to know. Hell, I don't want anybody to know. This is between you and me." It took Red 3 days to track down the information. 3 days during which Elvis could barely eat, could barely sleep, could barely function. He kept thinking about Tommy crying himself to sleep, about Sarah Ann ready to give up, about a mother working 3 jobs just to keep her children from starving. When Red finally called back, his voice was different, quieter. "Elvis, I found them, but boss, it's worse than you think." Elvis felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "The address on the letter, it's not a house, it's a trailer, and I mean an old trailer probably from the 50s. No running water, no electricity like the girl said, but Elvis, there's something else." "What?" Red was quiet for a long moment. "I talked to some neighbors. Sarah Ann's mother, she died 3 months ago, pneumonia, couldn't afford to see a doctor until it was too late." The phone slipped from Elvis's hand. He had to sit down on the floor because his legs wouldn't hold him up anymore. Sarah Ann's mother was dead, had been dead for months, which meant... "The kids," Elvis managed to whisper. "They're still there, living alone. The neighbors have been trying to help when they can, but everyone around there is struggling. Social services doesn't even know about them yet. Sarah Ann's been forging her mother's signature on school papers, pretending everything's normal." Elvis felt like he was going to be sick. This 12-year-old girl had been keeping herself and her 8-year-old brother alive for 3 months, alone, and she'd still taken the time to write him a letter about hope. "Red, I need you to get me there, tonight, and I need you to fill up a truck with supplies, food, clothes, blankets, everything they might need, but I want to deliver it myself." "Boss, are you sure that's a good idea? What if someone recognizes you?" "I don't care. These kids have been alone long enough." The drive to Hazard took 6 hours through winding mountain roads that reminded Elvis way too much of his own childhood. The poverty was everywhere. Rundown houses, rusted cars, people who looked like they'd given up hopping for anything better. When they finally found rural Route 3, Elvis's heart nearly broke all over again. The trailer Red had described was worse in person. It was barely holding together, propped up on cinder blocks, with a tarp over one corner where the roof had caved in. But there was light coming from inside, not electric light, candle light. Elvis walked up to the door alone, carrying a box of groceries, trying to figure out what he was going to say. How do you explain to a 12-year-old girl that Elvis Presley got her letter and drove 6 hours just to make sure she was okay? He knocked softly. After a moment, he heard footsteps, small, careful footsteps. "Who is it?" The voice was young, scared. "Sarah Ann, my name is Elvis. Elvis Presley, I got your letter." Silence, then the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened just a crack, and Elvis found himself looking into the face of the bravest little girl he'd ever seen. She was tiny, probably underweight, with dark circles under her eyes that told the story of too many sleepless nights. But her eyes were strong, determined. "You're not really Elvis Presley," she said matter-of-factly. "Elvis Presley wouldn't come to a place like this." Elvis smiled despite everything. "Well, I am really Elvis Presley, and you're wrong about one thing, honey. I come from a place just like this." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because Sarah Ann opened the door wider. Behind her, Elvis could see a little boy peeking out from behind a makeshift curtain. Tommy, 8 years old, and trying to be brave like his big sister. "Why are you here?" Sarah Ann asked, and Elvis could hear the fear underneath her courage. "We didn't ask for anything. I told you in the letter we weren't asking for anything." "I know you didn't ask," Elvis said gently, "but I needed to come anyway, because Sarah Ann, your letter, it reminded me of something I'd forgotten. It reminded me where I come from, and it reminded me why I'm supposed to use this voice I was given." Sarah Ann started crying then, not the dramatic sobs of a child throwing a tantrum, but the quiet, heartbroken tears of someone who'd been trying to be strong for too long. "I've been so scared," she whispered. "I've been trying to take care of Tommy, but I don't know how to do anything. I don't know how to pay bills or buy food or what happens if they find out Mama's gone." Elvis knelt down so he was at her eye level. "Sarah Ann, listen to me very carefully. You are the strongest person I've ever met. What you've been doing, taking care of your brother all by yourself, that takes more courage than anything I've ever done in my life. But what if I can't keep doing it? What if I'm not strong enough?" That's when Elvis made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because it was wrong, but because it was right. And being right was going to cost him everything. "You don't have to be strong enough anymore, honey, because I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure you and Tommy are safe and taken care of. But I need you to promise me something." "What?" "I need you to promise me you'll never tell anyone about this. Not your friends, not your teachers, not anybody. Because if people find out, it won't just be about helping you anymore. It'll become something else, something that might hurt both of us." Sarah Ann nodded, understanding in that way that children who have grown up too fast always understand. "Okay, Mr. Elvis, I promise, but why are you really doing this?" Elvis looked at this little girl who'd been through hell and was still worried about keeping promises, and he told her the truth. "Because 20 years ago, I was a scared little boy just like Tommy, and I wished every day that someone would come and tell me everything was going to be okay. Nobody ever came for me, Sarah Ann, but I can come for you." What Elvis didn't know was that his decision to save Sarah Ann and Tommy would end up destroying him. Because when you become someone's savior, you also become responsible for everyone you don't save. And Elvis Presley was about to learn that carrying the weight of being hope for the hopeless was more than any human being was meant to bear. Elvis kept his promise to Sarah Ann and Tommy, but keeping that promise nearly killed him. Within a week of finding them, he'd quietly moved the kids to a small house in Memphis. Not anywhere fancy, not anywhere that would raise questions, but somewhere safe. Somewhere with electricity and running water and a refrigerator full of food. He set up a trust fund through a lawyer who specialized in discreet transactions, ensuring they'd never want for anything again. But Elvis made them swear to keep living like regular kids. Go to school, make friends, be normal. The world could never know that Elvis Presley had become their guardian angel. And that secret began eating him alive. See, once Elvis opened that door in his heart, he couldn't close it again. Every piece of fan mail became a potential Sarah Ann. Every sob story became a life-or-death emergency. He started reading every single letter that came to Graceland, staying up until dawn going through thousands of pleas for help. Red West later said it was like watching a man slowly drown in other people's pain. He'd call me at 3 in the morning, Red remembered. There'd be this family in Alabama whose house burned down, or a kid in Mississippi who needed surgery they couldn't afford. Elvis would have me investigate each case, verify the stories. If they were real, he'd help. But it had to stay secret, always secret. Within 6 months, Elvis was secretly supporting over 40 families across the South, paying medical bills, rent, school tuition, buying groceries, clothes, Christmas presents for kids whose parents couldn't afford them. But he couldn't tell anyone, couldn't share the burden, couldn't even get credit for the good he was doing. The psychological toll was devastating. Elvis started having panic attacks during concerts. He'd be in the middle of singing "Love Me Tender," and suddenly he'd think about all the Sarah Anns out there listening, all the families who might be depending on his voice to give them hope for one more day. The weight would hit him like a physical blow, and he'd have to grip the microphone stand to keep from collapsing. Joe Esposito noticed the change immediately. Elvis started acting like every performance might be someone's last chance to hear hope. Like if he didn't give everything he had, some kid somewhere might not make it through the night. The drugs got worse, not because Elvis was partying, but because he couldn't sleep, couldn't turn off the voice in his head that kept saying, "What if there's another letter in that pile? What if someone needs you right now and you're up here sleeping in your mansion?" By the spring of 1977, Elvis was reading over 1,000 letters a week personally. His staff thought he was losing his mind. They'd find him at 5 in the morning, surrounded by fan mail, crying over stories of kids with cancer, families losing their homes, elderly people choosing between medicine and food. But the breaking point came in July. A letter arrived from a teenage girl in Arkansas. She was 17, taking care of her disabled father and 3 younger siblings after her mother abandoned them. The electricity was about to be shut off. They were 3 months behind on rent, and she was 1 week away from agging out of the system that would have protected her siblings. "Mr. Elvis," she wrote, "I know you probably get a million letters like this, but I heard from someone that you actually read them. So I'm praying that maybe you'll read mine, because I don't know what else to do. If we lose this house, they're going to split us up, put my brothers and sister in foster care, and I can't let that happen. I can't fail them like everyone else has." Elvis read that letter and saw Sarah Ann all over again. Saw himself at 17, desperate and alone, and convinced that nobody in the world cared if he lived or died. He sent Red to Arkansas that very night. But when Red got there, he found something that would destroy Elvis completely. The girl and her family were gone, evicted 3 days earlier, scattered to different foster homes across the state. The letter had taken a week to reach Memphis, and Elvis was a week too late. When Red called with the news, Elvis didn't say a word. He just hung up the phone and locked himself in his bedroom for 2 days. That's when Elvis started writing letters back. Not letters he'd send, letters he'd never send, but letters to every person who'd ever written to him asking for help. Hundreds of them, thousands, all saying the same thing: "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry I couldn't save you all." Ginger Alden, who was with Elvis during his final weeks, later found boxes of these letters hidden in his closet. They were heartbreaking, she said. Page after page of Elvis apologizing to people, blaming himself for every tragedy he couldn't prevent. It was like he thought he was supposed to be God or something, like he was supposed to be able to reach every person who needed help. On August 16, 1977, the day Elvis died, he was found with a letter in his hand. Not Sarah Ann's original letter, though he still carried that in his wallet. This was a new letter, one that had arrived just that morning. It was from a little boy in Louisiana, 8 years old, the same age Tommy had been when Elvis found him. The boy was sick, probably dying, and his only request was to hear Elvis sing "Love Me Tender" one more time. Elvis had been trying to call the boy's family when his heart finally gave out. The phone was still off the hook. The boy's number was still written on a piece of paper next to Elvis's bed. After Elvis died, Sarah Ann finally broke her promise. She told the world about the letter that had brought Elvis to her door, about the man who'd saved her and Tommy without asking for anything in return, about the secret burden he'd carried for 8 months, trying to be everyone's guardian angel. That's when other families started coming forward. The Alabama family whose house fire he'd helped with, the Mississippi kid whose surgery he'd paid for, dozens of them, all with the same story. Elvis had helped them in secret, asked for nothing, and made them promise never to tell. The trust funds Elvis had set up were still active, still helping families decades later. Sarah Ann used her education, paid for by Elvis, to become a social worker. Tommy grew up to be a teacher. Both of them dedicated their lives to helping other people the way Elvis had helped them. But here's the thing that haunts everyone who knew the real story. Elvis died trying to help one more person. His heart gave out not from the drugs, or the lifestyle, or the pressures of fame. It gave out from carrying the weight of being hope for every desperate person who'd ever reached out to him. Sarah Ann, now in her 60s, still keeps Elvis's original response to her letter. Not the letter she sent him, but the letter he wrote back. The one he never sent, but carried with him until the day he died. It said simply, "Dear Sarah Ann, you showed me why I was given this voice. Thank you for letting me be your hope. I promise I'll never forget that people like us have to take care of each other. Love, Elvis." Elvis Presley died believing he'd failed the people who needed him most. But the truth is, he'd spent his final months proving that being the king of rock and roll was nothing compared to being the guardian angel for kids who had nowhere else to turn. The letter that broke Elvis Presley also revealed the size of his heart, and maybe that's the most important legacy of all. Elvis died carrying the weight of being hope itself for millions of people. He understood that his voice wasn't just entertainment, it was survival for families like Sarah Ann's. The secret burden he carried reminds us that sometimes the people who seem to have everything are the ones struggling most with how much they can give. Have you ever felt responsible for being someone else's hope? Share your story in the comments below. And remember, Elvis's greatest gift wasn't his voice, it was his heart.